A Las Vegas pawn shop is probably the last place you would expect to find a 2,000-year-old royal crown, a mummified messenger of the pharaoh gods, or a helmet that outlasted an entire civilization by 14 centuries. But that is exactly what kept happening at the gold and silver, and the stories behind each of these objects are stranger and more layered than anything a screenwriter would dare invent. Every entry on this list came in through that same door, got handled by the same people, and left carrying a dollar value that either shocked the seller into silence or sent them out with more money than they had earned in the previous year. This is every royal artifact, ancient helmet, and pharaonic relic ever brought into Pawn Stars, ranked. Kevin walked into the shop in season 17 carrying what he called an old football helmet from the 1800s, picked up at an estate sale because it looked interesting. He set it on the counter in front of Chumley, and what landed there looked like a corroded metal bowl, the kind of object most people pass at a garage sale without slowing down. Kevin had his hopes pinned on $750. Chumley stared at it and knew immediately that nothing American had ever been shaped like that. Bob Dodge, founder of the Artemis testing lab, walked in, looked at the piece for roughly 10 seconds, and announced that what Kevin had found was an authentic Anglo-Saxon Spangenhelm helmet dating to somewhere between the 6th and 8th centuries CE, which put it at more than 1,400 years old. The Spangenhelm was the battlefield helmet of choice across Anglo-Saxon England, Viking Scandinavia, and the broader Germanic world during the early medieval period, and the name itself comes from the German word for the iron bands that formed its skeleton, metal strips riveted together to support panels that covered the skull. The most expensive versions, the ones reserved for kings and elite warriors, were forged entirely from iron and carbon steel, while lower-ranking fighters made do with animal horn or hardened leather fitted between iron frames. Bob Dodge ran an XRF analyzer over Kevin's helmet, firing X-rays at the metal to read its elemental composition, and what came back confirmed solid carbon steel throughout, placing this helmet in the category worn by the highest-ranking fighters of the Anglo-Saxon world. What makes a Spangenhelm so rare today is simple chemistry. Iron breaks down when oxygen gets to it, and 14 centuries of exposure to open air reduces most helmets from this period to dust. The only specimens that survive are those that ended up in extremely low oxygen environments: bogs, riverbeds, sealed burial chambers. Kevin's helmet arrived nearly intact, and Dodge described that on camera as a 1 in a million find. The valuation landed between $12,000 and $15,000. Chumley closed it at $10,000 flat, which meant Kevin walked out with more than 13 times what he had walked in hoping for. The helmet later appeared at auction through Artemis Fine Arts, confirming that what had sat in an estate sale pile was genuine early medieval history. In season 14, a seller walked in carrying a gold ring she had inherited from her world-traveling stepmother, along with a family story that it bore a royal hieroglyphic inscription from the golden era of ancient Egypt's most powerful dynasties. She was asking $15,000. Rick Harrison brought in an antiquities specialist who translated the symbols stamped into the ring's face: a sun, a rake, a scarab, and an ibis, a combination that placed the ring squarely within Egypt's 18th dynasty. That is not a minor footnote. The 18th dynasty produced Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, Thutmose III, and Hatshepsut, the single period in Egyptian history that the world remains most fascinated by. The ring was real. Genuinely 3,000 years old, produced in the workshops of an empire at the height of its power. And then the expert explained why that didn't matter as much as she thought. The scarab was not a royal exclusive symbol. In ancient Egyptian belief, the scarab beetle represented the god Khepri, the force of creation and the rising sun, and protective scarabs were placed in burials across every social class, from royal tombs to the modest graves of ordinary people. Because the Egyptian empire lasted more than 3 millennia, and the scarab appeared throughout that entire span, millions were produced, and authentic 18th dynasty scarabs turn up at auction regularly for hundreds of dollars rather than thousands. The expert placed the ring's value at $450 to $500. She had walked in expecting $15,000. Rick settled it at $360. And she left with one of the most emotionally deflating departures in the shop's history, carrying an object that was exactly what her family had said it was, just not worth what any of them had assumed. A different seller arrived in a later season carrying a framed piece of carved sandstone, presenting it with full confidence and claiming an archaeologist friend had verified it as an authentic Old Kingdom carving of a pharaoh worth roughly $25,000. The Old Kingdom spans approximately 2700 to 2200 BCE, which would make a genuine piece older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Rick Harrison's skepticism kicked in before the expert arrived because the wear patterns on the stone looked wrong. Objects that spend 4,000 years underground develop erosion that is inconsistent, unpredictable, shaped by whatever microenvironments they pass through over the millennia, and this stone's surface looked too even, too deliberate. Bob Dodge confirmed Rick's read on the texture and noted the stone was too soft, but the definitive moment came when Dodge examined the crown carved into the figure's head. The headdress style, he explained, had never existed in ancient Egypt, a completely imaginary design shaped by modern fantasy rather than any historical reference. Dodge offered $20 for the picture frame. Rick passed on everything else, and the seller walked out with an expensive, well-framed piece of modern stone carving. Season 10 brought something that Rick Harrison later described as a quintessential Las Vegas moment. A seller walking through that door carrying a small, intact animal mummy, still wrapped in its original linen, sealed inside a decorated sarcophagus. Tom Lindgren, who served as co-consulting director of the Natural History Department at Bonhams in Los Angeles, came in to examine it and asked immediately what kind of bird was inside the wrappings. When Rick said he didn't know, Lindgren studied the sarcophagus and linen closely and identified it as a falcon. That single identification changed everything, because in ancient Egyptian religion, the falcon was the earthly form of Horus, one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, worshipped continuously from before the unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE all the way through the Greco-Roman period. Every pharaoh of Egypt was considered the living incarnation of Horus, which meant the falcon was not simply a bird. It was the physical symbol of divine kingship itself. Falcon mummies were produced throughout the late period and Ptolemaic era as votive offerings to Horus at temples across Egypt, and while millions were made over the centuries, the vast majority have deteriorated or reduced to scattered bones. Lindgren used a loupe to examine the linen closely, checking the wrapping style, the geometric weaving pattern, and the sarcophagus construction, all of which he found consistent with authentic Ptolemaic craftsmanship dating the piece to somewhere between 2,500 and 2,600 years ago. He valued it at $10,000 to $12,000, and Rick closed the deal, adding a mummified representative of the pharaoh's divine protector to his display case. Season 13 brought a seller named Jad through the door carrying an Egyptian cartonnage mummy mask, the layered composite of linen, papyrus, and plaster that ancient Egyptians shaped into funeral masks painted to represent the face and upper body of the deceased. Jad dated it to the 2nd century AD, the Romano-Egyptian period, when Egyptian burial traditions blended with Greek and Roman artistic influences, and he was asking $70,000. Dr. Phineas Castle, the antiquities expert called in to examine the piece, confirmed the cartonnage construction, the authentic polychrome painting, and the preservation, which he described as impeccable for an object nearly 2,000 years old. What made the mask extraordinary beyond its age was painted on the back, where the deceased appeared resting on the back of a lion, a motif Castle identified as reserved for individuals of royal or near-royal status. Castle then identified the crown depicted on the mask's front face as the hedjet, the white conical crown of Upper Egypt, one of the two foundational crowns of Egyptian sovereignty. When combined with the red Deshret crown of Lower Egypt, the hedjet formed the double crown of all Egypt, and having it depicted on a mummy mask led Castle to conclude this was almost certainly the burial mask of a royal priestess or a queen. His one complication was that a piece like this belonged in a museum, which brought the valuation down to $20,000 to $22,000. Jad had come in at $70,000, and the negotiation ground down through several rounds before Corey Harrison agreed to buy it at $30,000. The Hellenistic bronze combat helmet that an antiquities collector brought in tested Rick's nerves before any expert arrived, because ancient bronze armor ranks among the most commonly faked categories in the entire antiquities market. The method is straightforward. Take a newly cast piece, treat it with chemical acids to simulate the green patina that develops on copper alloy objects over centuries of burial, and sell it to someone who doesn't know what genuine oxidation looks like at the microscopic level. The expert Rick called in examined the patina in natural and raking light, checked the structural oxidation at the edges, and assessed the construction technique, concluding the piece was authentic, a genuine Hellenistic period combat helmet more than 2,300 years old, placing it in the tradition of Greek defensive armor that evolved from the enclosed Corinthian style toward the open-faced designs that equipped the armies of Alexander the Great's successors. The nose guard had been restored, which lowered the value for serious collectors, and the expert placed it at $7,000 to $8,000. Rick pushed hard on the restoration issue and closed at $6,500. A seller who had bought the contents of a Las Vegas costume shop 30 years earlier arrived in Season 7 carrying a full British Grenadier Guard dress uniform, complete with the towering black fur headdress, asking $2,500 and expecting a short conversation. Rick Harrison stopped him almost immediately to explain that the Grenadier Guard uniform is not a costume. It belongs to one of the most precisely regulated ceremonial military units in the world, a regiment whose continuous history runs back to 1642 and whose primary duty is the protection of the British monarch. Mark Hall Patton, the Clark County Museum curator, examined the buttons, the coat's construction, and the interior tags, finding a stamp reading GRRG, a regimental designation placing the uniform within the reign of King George VI, who ruled from 1937 until his death in 1952. Hall Patton then explained that officers wore caps made from Canadian brown bear fur, while enlisted soldiers wore black bear fur caps, and this cap was black bear, meaning it had been worn by an enlisted soldier. The valuation came in at $400 to $500. The uniform was missing its correct regimental belt buckle. Rick offered $325, and the seller refused to go below $1,000, walking out with the uniform still under his arm. In Season 8, a seller walked in carrying a Victorian-era platinum and diamond tiara, formally documented and photographically verified as worn by Ida Saxton McKinley, the First Lady of the United States during William McKinley's presidency from 1897 until his assassination in 1901. The tiara's diamond wings could be detached from the platinum band and worn separately as individual brooches, a level of engineering at that period in American history that traced back to J.E. Caldwell and Son, one of New York's most prestigious jewelers. The seller was asking $75,000. Rick ran the numbers before anyone spoke, calculating that stripped down to raw platinum and diamonds, the scrap value came to roughly $7,000, meaning every dollar above that rested entirely on provenance. Greg, the historical jewelry expert called in, examined the construction, tested the detachable mechanism, and reviewed White House photographs showing Ida McKinley wearing this exact piece, delivering a verdict that the provenance was solid and supported the full $75,000 asking price. Rick opened at $35,000. No deal was reached that day, but the seller returned and eventually agreed to $43,000. What happened after the sale was something nobody anticipated. Rick Harrison has lived with epilepsy since childhood, and Ida McKinley was one of the most publicly known epilepsy sufferers of the 19th century, her condition serious enough that President McKinley developed his own approach to managing her seizures during state dinners. Rather than marking the tiara up and putting it in the display case, Rick contacted the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio, and offered to sell them the piece for exactly $43,000, no markup, no margin. The museum had it independently appraised at the full $75,000 and launched an emergency fundraising campaign that drew donations from 22 states, hitting its goal at a benefit concert in June 2014. The tiara arrived by FedEx shortly after and went on permanent display in the McKinley Gallery, where it remains today, and Rick donated the proceeds to the Epilepsy Foundation in Ida McKinley's name.